I actually think in some odd way the accelerationism of Trudeau's mass immigration might have done the country a favor by making it acceptable to talk about immigration for the first time I can ever remember.
Do you think that Canada, hopefully, but also other Anglosphere relations will learn from Poilievre's defeat that you can't squish your way to victory anymore? Like, you can't just rebrand and microwave David Cameron's 2010 conservatism as the antidote to the total woke takeover of the institutions.
The thing about Canada is it's a bit like other Western countries, but even more so. So, you have an elite political culture which is divorced from that of the mass population. The elite political culture is woke. It is pro-mass migration, it is pro-multiculturalism, and so they insulate the debate from the public.
And most Canadian people, until very, very recently, could trace their heritage back to 200 years in that kind of European direction. Then, of course, you've got the Indigenous mix there as well, and their rights to reservations should be respected and all the rest of it. But it really was it was a binational situation. It was never just this kind of multi-culti mosaic. Welcome back to Deprogrammed. This is the show where we do our best to fight back against the forces of ideological conformity, especially among the young. I'm Harrison Pitt. I'm a contributing editor at the European Conservative, and I'm delighted to be joined today, as ever, by Connor Tomlinson, one of the leading contributors to Courage Media, and our special guest this week, Professor from the University of Buckingham, none other than Eric Kaufmann, who is a much-loved friend of the show. Eric, welcome.
We to be back, Harrison.
Pleasure to have you. So we should probably say in advance, so we're going to be talking primarily about Canada today. You're a Canadian yourself. And we're filming on the afternoon of Tuesday, the 29th of April, just because it's somewhat of a live situation. This may be out of date by the time this goes out, just to some degree, but probably not, because the general thrust of the story is that the Liberal Mark Carney has won the general election in Canada against the alleged conservative Pierre Poilievre, who even looks likely at this point, I don't know if there's been an update on this, but to lose his seat. So it's a pretty devastating night for him. Like, Canada is already considered in the Anglosphere, particularly among conservatives, as a kind of cautionary tale, because it's kind of often described as a kind of woke dystopia. Do you see, under Trudeau not least, they swapped in Carney for Trudeau at the last minute in January. Do you? And so they've tried to. They seem to understand that Trudeau is not a popular figure in Canada. Do you think that Carney is going to be continuing Trudeau's legacy?
I do think so. I mean, he's not as aggressively in your face about woke. He's not signaling woke, but he will essentially run interference for woke in the institutions. So it will be a continuation of the Cultural Revolution in the institutions on the Indigenous issue, the trans issue, and a continuation of the regime ideologies around multiculturalism and mass immigration, even though it may not be quite as ridiculous as under Trudeau. The numbers that Carney was mentioning, 1% of the population, i.e. 400,000 a year, which in Britain that would be 600,000 a year. That's sort of what they're targeting. Now, I won't say Poilievre was much better, but 285 is not 400, and the temporary foreign worker numbers are not as bad. But yeah, I think it would be a continuation of the previous cultural revolution.
So immigration actually wasn't front and center in this campaign in the way that it probably should have been, given the fact that Canada has been going through an incredibly radicalizing demographic process over the last 5 years in particular. I think they've naturalized a million new citizens just in the last 3 years. The foreign-born population of Canada is now 23%. They've had a sort of multicultural, state-sponsored ideology since the 1960s, helped along by intellectuals like Will Kymlicka and Charles Taylor. So they're in dire straits, and yet immigration didn't seem to be front and center in this campaign. But when you do ask Canadians what they think about immigration, 70% of them, roughly 70% of them, want it to come drastically down. Yet the Canadian political system only seems capable of producing political leaders who compete to see who can import as many people from the Indian subcontinent as possible. Why is this the case in Canadian politics? Why has there not been a breakthrough?
Well, I mean, it is worth saying that, you had that embarrassing, cringy video where Justin Trudeau sort of said, oh, well, there's people exploited the system and too many came in. We're getting it under control, right? So there was actually, even the mainstream media in Globe and Mail and others kind of admitted that this could be an issue, and some economists from the Bank of Canada said, this could be putting pressure on housing prices. So there was just this brief... I actually think in some odd way the accelerationism of Trudeau's mass immigration might have done the country a favor by making it acceptable to talk about immigration for the first time I can ever ever remember. And so that's perhaps a silver lining in the disaster. But you know what the thing about Canada is, it's a bit like other Western countries, but even more so. So you know, you have an elite political culture which is divorced from that of the mass population. The elite political culture is woke. It is pro-mass migration. It is pro-multiculturalism. And so they insulate the debate from the public. And you saw that in the official election debates, where in Quebec, which has a more sensible political culture, there you saw immigration debated in the French debates. Even though Quebec's immigration level and foreign-born share is lower, considerably or somewhat lower than English Canada, in the English debates, this was frozen out entirely, and all they were allowed to talk about was the economy and foreign policy and Trump, the sort of topics that play to the Liberal strengths. That was interesting to me, and I think it's revealing of how powerful these elite norms are in controlling the conversation and manufacturing consent for the existing way of doing things.
Do you think that not only curtailed the boundaries of public debate, but do you think that influenced the campaign of Poilievre? So one of the discussions we've had in the UK context, for example, is despite the country at large wanting immigration in 9 in 10 constituencies to decrease, and that's when they're underestimating net migration by a factor of 10 every year. They think it's 70,000, it's 700,000 to 900,000 every year. Despite this, the pressures of the media and political bubble in Westminster make politicians think that there's a third rail they can never touch. So saying, I want to deport all illegal immigrants has, until seemingly the last week when the Conservatism reform are jockeying for credibility on who will actually do it, seemed to be a beyond the pale issue, even though the majority of their voters and the broader public support it. Do you think the same things happened within the party, not just within the country, but because obviously Canadian state media and all of their allies really don't want to talk about the issue?
Oh, definitely, Connor. I mean, I think you can see that, the MPs are in a number of different factions. The grassroots really is where the pressure is coming from to act on, for example, the trans issue, which Poilievre's been late to and quiet on. The immigration issue. There's resistance and reluctance because they want to be kind of accepted by the media, by political culture. Again, that pressure you can definitely see to shy away from issues that are politically incorrect. It's probably stronger. I would say it's stronger in Canada than here. I mean, I think it is to some degree weakened. I think there's an opportunity. And I think, however, if Poilievre had leaned into those issues and gone after Trudeau on immigration, I think that would have helped him. I certainly don't think it would have hurt him. Now, it may not have made much difference to his vote. I mean, you can look at the U.S. and look at Trump, for example, versus Romney versus McCain versus et cetera, and you can see that, Trump, this whole idea that by talking up immigration you would lose Latinos, you could lose, liberals. I think that's not right. I think you could have brought those people along even with a much stronger message, and you would have got some other voters, maybe people who would never ordinarily vote. So, the answer is that these elite political norms are very powerful, and they do create an Overton window around what you're allowed to debate. It's just a question of how you widen that. And typically populist parties or grassroots movements provide the pressure. So in Canada, at the Conservative Party convention, you will get the grassroots pressure like, why aren't we talking about trans? Why aren't we talking about some of these other issues? Why is it all axe the tax and it's all bread and butter stuff? And, typically Poilievre will have kind of absorbed that, go away, and then it's just business as usual, playing it safe. Because also I think he himself is basically a libertarian 1980s Reaganite style politician. I don't think he really cares that much about these other issues. Although, there are people who say when in private he's much more kind of aligned. I don't know how true or not true that is. Others say no, that's just for show for his internal staff, and it's not actually real. Certainly in public, it's not real. I mean, he's always been behind the curve on all these things.
Hello. Please excuse this brief interruption, but I'd be really grateful if you could please hit the subscribe button and subscribe to our channel. Our mission is vitally important, and we must grow this channel to ensure that our content reaches the biggest possible audience. The best way to do this is for you to subscribe. It's totally free. And in addition to subscribing, if you're able to donate or join our membership scheme, please click on the link in the description or visit our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. We've got great plans ahead, but we can't do it without your support. From only £4 per month, you'll receive a range of perks and benefits, including exclusive content. Thank you.
He looks very happy and turban in particular. Another problem with radically balkanizing your country in this way, to an extent where you do have a 23% foreign-born population that is, just by its very nature, particularly if it's coming from very culturally distant parts of the world, going to be poorly assimilated, is that it creates pressures, even for the most conservative politicians, which I wouldn't count Poilievre as one, but nevertheless he identifies as one, to engage in a kind of ethnic pandering. And so he is, not only does he campaign in turbans at times, and not only has he hardly challenged the immigration consensus that has existed in Canada for a good many years now, but he even often appeases these groups. So he'll sort of address a predominantly Sikh audience and say, if you stick by me, I will make sure that there are more direct flights between Amritsar and Toronto, and I will make it easier for you to engage in sort of family reunification, which, like in the American system, has become an American immigration system has become an important feature of Canada's immigration system. A lot of these groups just want to bring their uncles in, their cousins in, and conservatives increasingly, or self-identifying conservatives, feel an immense amount of pressure to do that.
Yeah, and what makes it worse, I'd say, in the Canadian case compared to Britain or the US is just the geography of the vote. So Canada's becoming a more polarized country, especially the white population is starting to sorting quite strongly into conservative and left camps. And this election, I think, shows that very clearly. The conservative vote is actually up over, it's higher than wherever it's been for the past 20, 25 years.
Yes. You've got 42% of the overall vote.
42,
roughly.
Yeah, exactly. Up from, I think in 2015 it was like low 30s. But in any case, so there's actually a rising trajectory for the right. But
for the self-identifying right.
Self-identifying right. But so you've got this kind of polarizing dynamic, but one of the groups, as in the US, that is more swingy is the ethnic minority vote. And they're kind of moving each election, so they are a real prize, and they're mainly based in the sort of inner suburban belt in Toronto and Vancouver, and to some degree Montreal. That's where the concentration is. And those ridings, what are called the 905 Toronto ridings, are a very key battleground, and that's one of the reasons that they're encouraged to lean even more into this. In fact, the Conservatives have been doing this, playing this kind of ethnic politics for decades. So that's nothing new. Whereas in Britain, the minority votes tend to pile up in labor areas, and therefore it's not the red wall is more the swing district, or in the U.S. it's the Rust Belt, and so therefore the focus of politics is a little bit different, is a bit healthier in many ways.
Well, far be it from me to disagree with a sort of fantastic book on essentially white flight and ethnopolitics. However, I do think the situation's changed slightly in the UK, and I wonder if that is a parallel to Canada, because the Conservative Party now codes as like the Indian Hindu Party, and the Labour Party codes as we want to keep the Pakistani Muslim vote on the reservation, but they're flirting with
right.
independent Muslim candidates, and so we have to do everything we can to build airports in Mirpur and pass Islamic blasphemy laws. And in the last election, there was Hindu and Sikh manifestos that Conservative candidates signed up to, including Bob Blackman, who, you couldn't get a more English name if you tried. Because he's in a heavily Indian constituency, he felt the need to pander to that ethno-religious bloc. So I was wondering if the demographic is similar in Canada, in that there's not just an immigrant vote, it's that the parties respectively code according to ethnic or religious lines. Because I know... What's the third party that was led by the Sikh nationalists?
NDP, but they're not. I mean, I wouldn't think they get a lot of Sikh votes. The NDP. I mean, this is more of a white leftist,
it's like
white progressive
left, social democrats.
Yeah, I mean the sort of the immigrant, the Chinese, Sikh, Hindu, that type of person is living in kind of suburban Toronto or Vancouver. They are not as steeped in the kind of left-wing mythology of Canada. That's not as important
It's
to
not,
who
it's not
they
about the
are.
Labour tradition or anything
It's
like that.
more, it's more somewhat self-interested, somewhat, and it's very hard. I wouldn't say there's an easy coding. No, other than Jews voting conservative, but other than that, I don't think there's any easy. There's no easy coding. I mean,
Is that because the Liberal Party and the NDP went in all in the Palestine issue this time around?
I think they're just more associated with that, and the Tories are more associated with it, with defending Israel.
Right.
And so, but other than that, so you saw that this election. I mean, Thornhill, some of the North Toronto blue areas would be the Jewish areas, but other than that, the Asian vote is really quite fluid at this point. And it's dominated by Chinese and Sikh, to some degree Hindu, and so I wouldn't say there's that coding developed just yet. But all the parties play this game, and they all play the ethnic vote and pander to it. And yeah, I mean, it certainly doesn't help national unity. And this is just one of the. I mean, I don't think this is ultimately going to decide elections in a huge way. There also doesn't seem to be a fixed trend. Like in the U.S., we're seeing the Hispanics and Asians, they've had since 2008, that's like almost 20 years of drifting to the right. So there seems a trajectory there. Mind you, they were more to the left. I mean, Latinos and Asians were a relatively heavy Democrat group, whereas Chinese and Sikhs, they're kind of hanging out in the middle, so it's not really obvious that there's no obvious trend for them just to move one way or the other.
And the younger these groups are, and they do tend to be the youngest cohorts, or rather the younger generations in Canada, in Britain, and in the United States are the youngest, are the most ethnically diverse generation. It tends to be the younger Hispanics, the younger Asians, the younger, who certainly in America, I know the American data best, who are most sort of avowedly left-wing. And so there's actually no guarantee that those conservative gains are going to be maintained into the future as their grandparents done.
Yeah, that level of split's very hard to be clear about what's going on. I wouldn't bet my farm on that. But but you mentioned the young vote, which I think is an interesting wrinkle, which maybe would be interesting for your viewers, because one of the things, and we don't yet know, but certainly the polling beforehand seemed to suggest that younger voters are more likely to have been conservative than older voters in Canada.
I think it was 44% to 32% in the polling that I saw published by the BBC this morning. So we're seeing, and that was mainly pronounced among young men. So if you broke that down by gender, it would even be a much larger swing.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's a lot of dissatisfaction in the younger population, and there's less sensitivity to the Trump issue. Now, exactly what that is remains to be unpacked. I mean, the narrative is, difficulty getting on the housing ladder. I mean, undoubtedly, that is a big part of it. I just don't know. The other part of it, of course, is that the younger Canadian population is not tuning into mainstream media and is much more likely to be tuning into alternative media or new media or social media. And I think that is a factor, because Canadian media, much more so, more so than British, by the way, British media is very much progressive captured. Electronic media, print media now. National Post is an exception to that, but certainly all the main networks. And the print side is less balanced than in Britain, because in Britain you have a more balanced print ecosystem. But in Canada, National Post is relatively small, not that influential, and the rest of the press is just very strongly liberal left.
Wasn't there a press poll at the debate that we were talking about right before we came on air, where there was a journalist from Rebel News, we didn't know if it was Ezra Levant himself or not, but they shut down the entire press pool because they couldn't figure out a loophole in the rules that would allow them to exclude them from asking a question. So they just stopped all journalists from asking questions. So it seems like they're all conspiring.
It's an absolute, I won't say a conspiracy, but it is certainly an interlocking set of people in the Liberal Party and in the left parties and the media. It's the same people who know each other. And it's interesting because, there was a sort of spat because one of the Rebel News reporters asked about the mass graves hoax, which is, a national lie that all parties are leaning into and continue to lean into.
Including Poilievre.
Yeah, exactly, including Poilievre. And that led to this shouting match or they were trying to essentially intimidate this person out of the room, which kind of shows you that there is a consensus there. And then the CBC anchor, Rosemary Barton, was getting up on her high horse, claiming this was all far right and stuff, and had to actually backtrack.
Just checking, they have still not discovered one body and just rocks, right?
Correct. Not only that, and they actually don't have records of parents looking for missing children at the school, right? So you kind of think, so only evidence they have is essentially oral testimony, which is, let's just put it, strongly motivated by either financial or ideological reasons. So, yeah, I mean, it's a pretty pathetic collapse of what Jonathan Rauch would call the truth-based order, or George Orwell would call the truth-based order, is kind of more or less suspended for the sacred, for certain sacred cows. But yeah, so that was kind of very revealing of when the system will club together and exclude. Now, I'm not saying everything Rebel News does is super high quality, but it's still revealing on that question where it's straight down the line factual question. That occurred, right? And in fact, and I know somebody, the Hub, which is quite a decent new website on Canadian politics, sort of center-right, and somebody, a journalist who I know there, basically, and a number of journalists who worked in mainstream outlets, like the CBC or TV Ontario or wherever, would say, there were no conservatives. I mean, there were no conservatives at all. And so these are, media spaces that have essentially zero representation from roughly half the population.
I'd just like to stress a point as well, because it's relevant in Britain and it's relevant in the United States, and it's certainly relevant in Canada, that you don't learn, in my view, you don't learn everything that you need to know from the way in which demographics are reshaping a country simply by studying election outcomes, for exactly the reasons that Connor has hinted at in his appraisal of the kind of bifurcated nature of the Hindu vote increasingly in Britain, which is a kind of block that the Conservatives are trying to swallow up, and the Muslim vote that Labour have been able to have had a chronic dependence on for 20, 30 years, in which they're now potentially losing a grip over. What really matters is what's driving people to vote in these ways. And even if these voting blocks are voting for something that says conservative on the tin, if what's driving them to do so is a belief that this furthers their own ethnic interests in some way, that is not proof of assimilation. Would you agree?
No, absolutely.
Yeah,
I'd agree with that. I mean, I think with these groups there's a range, right? I mean, there are some who are, once you get in like the second, third generation, who, for example, would care about changing ethnic demographics and not necessarily like that.
Would you like to plug your paper on this, on ethnocultural traditionalism?
Yeah. So the idea is that there's this something separate from ethnicity called ethno-traditional nationalism, which is being attached to your nation, and part of that attachment, just like being attached to the food or the landscape, is the ethnic composition of the country.
Mm-hmm.
And that's detached from your own ethnicity. So you can be a Hispanic, but be attached to a majority white America and not want to see that shift rapidly. And so I think one of the things we're discovering is that, in fact, there are minorities who are ethno-traditional nationalists. And in fact, you see that in the U.S. case in particular with the Hispanics on the issue of immigration, which is, I think, or in this country, I remember doing a survey and talking about survey of British Sikhs, where it said, what do you identify with in Britain? And one of the questions was, a lot of people having red or blonde hair and blue eyes. And that actually scored higher amongst Sikhs, like considerably higher amongst Sikhs than amongst white Remain voters.
Yes.
So the Sikhs were kind of like white Leave voters, and then the white Remain voters were the outlier. And I think that's the kind, or the Hispanics who when given a phrase like, white people are under attack in America, the white Trump voters and the Hispanic and Asian Trump voters responded largely in the majority to that question at a roughly equal rate.
Do you think Conservatives nevertheless make the mistake of overestimating how many of those people there are, and the extent to which they can serve as a guarantee of maintaining our culture into the future? Would it not be more sensible to engage the precautionary principle here and welcome those into the movement who are avowed ethno-traditional nationalists with regard to Britain, in the same way that I would be that towards Japan? If I lived in Japan, I wouldn't want to see the indigenous population of Japan reduced to a minority in their own homeland. But do you think that we would be prudent not to overestimate the extent to which everyone can be fitted into that mold, and that therefore we should be relaxed about the whole demographic?
Oh gosh, yeah, no, we can't be relaxed about it. But I suppose they're all aiming at the same thing, which is to slow down this change. Mm-hmm. I think that's the goal, or should be the goal, is to try and craft a politics that says we need to slow down And immigration is not just about the economy. I mean, of course, this is the other part of this, is that the only acceptable way to talk about immigration is house prices. And, this was the Canadian debate, it's house prices, and it's putting pressure on various kinds of employment, and never ever discussing social cohesion, never ever discussing the loss of ethno-traditions, that's out of bounds. So yeah, I don't, we're still very far from getting there, including in this country. That's not what people are allowed to talk about. But I think, again, what would be interesting, or what is interesting in the Canadian case, is these age dynamics, which suggest actually the Canadian electorate of the future is going to be much more, say, divided the way the split will be more like the American electorate than the Canadian past.
I see.
Whereas if you were to look at Britain, you might say it looks like Britain's future looks more Canadian. I don't know whether that's true.
I'm delighted to hear it.
What's quite interesting, though, about the way that respective parties are handling immigration along the divide that you noted in White Shift, where people coach a lot of their immigration concerns, which are ethnocultural, in purely economic terms to avoid being called a racist, is that the Conservative Party, despite being responsible for the rapid ethnocultural change because of the Boris wave of millions of third world migrants in the last 4 years, a million Indians in 4 years is going to have a pretty significant impact on ethnocultural change. Now the Conservative Party are phrasing their critiques of immigration more in the ethnocultural sense than they are in the purely economic sense. Like, even Kemi Badenoch has come out and said, despite lobbying in 2018 for more Nigerian students and workers, has come out and said, yeah, demographic change is an issue because of cultural change. Same with Robert Jenrick, and I think it's because Robert Jenrick, of course, his children are Jewish, his wife is Jewish. After October the 7th, it was like a light switch went on. He was going, oh my God, all these people are in my country. I think their connection to those ethnocultural traditionalist minorities is driving that, whereas I think the pressure being put on the likes of Reform UK by the hostile media is similar to Poilievre, where they need to feel they can only talk about the roads, the NHS, and job opportunities, but you can still bring your culture. If you contribute to the economy, we'll welcome you one and all. I think that's the dynamic that's shaking out.
That's what Poilievre said, of course.
Yes, but that's also what Farage has said at the recent, even though he's hardened on immigration, which is welcome, saying we'll have a minister for deportations and we want to deport illegal migrants, he still felt the need to preface it all with that line and coach it in the economic frame.
Yeah, that is interesting. I mean, part of the problem is I think a lot of politicians, they don't know the arguments, and they fear somebody saying, oh, you think you need to be white to be British, do you? And they don't know the difference between saying slowing down ethnic change and you need to be white to be British. They haven't thought through those arguments. They don't know how to defend them. I don't know. I mean, that's my impression anyway. So the easiest thing is to just say, oh, it's all about pressure on services and jobs and house prices and and NHS, whatever. I mean, that's all they can. And you might say, well, so on the one hand, you might say, well, if those arguments work as some kind of code, fine. But the problem is, if then someone can come along and just say, oh, well, we'll actually put more money into those services, and there's your problem solved. We don't need to change. And so I don't think it's a satisfactory answer.
Do you think, but just connecting it back to the demographic issue, where, as you said, younger Canadians are not consuming mainstream media, so they aren't as concerned about Trump and foreign policy, and were more concerned in the polling with cost of living and housing. Do you think that Poilievre won them over because he was focusing on cost of living and housing, or
Carney?
No, Poilievre won over younger voters.
Oh, I'm sorry.
More focused. Or do you think it's that because they aren't watching mainstream media, they are actually more concerned about cultural issues and immigration than Poilievre was willing to say, and because they aren't watching the news, they can walk into a Tim Hortons and see that it's basically a portal to New Delhi now, and they aren't told, put your ideological blinkers on and think this is Canada's strength. Do you think they're actually more concerned about ethnocultural issues than the parties are representing?
I mean, I think they are. The question is how much, and we don't have any data on this, so I'm really not. I mean, it's very difficult to know for sure, but it's definitely something we need more data on. I'm trying to think how that would manifest itself. I mean, I think people are certainly noticing that there are ethnic divisions in terms of residential characteristics and so on. But I can't claim to have seen good data on cultural attitudes. One thing I will say, though, is if we look at residential segregation, or where people choose to live, who they choose to marry, it's a very similar picture in Britain and the US and Canada. generally areas that are relatively white will gain white population in aggregate terms, and areas that are relatively non-white will lose it in aggregate terms. All other things being equal. And the trends are pretty stark, and they're pretty much the same everywhere. There are a few areas that are gentrifying near urban cores, but if you take those out of the equation, it's basically the same universal pattern. Like Toronto, for example, it might be 50%, maybe slightly more than 50% non-white. The number of marriages that cross a racial line is about 8%. And so you kind of, and it's very clear that areas that are already changing start to change faster. So it's kind of, it's similar here. If you go to Newham, for example, you can, these are not areas, or Barking, these are not areas that are going to become white again. They are now on a trajectory where they're going to become eventually looking like Wembley, or become almost entirely non-white British. And I think that's the trajectory in Canadian suburbs. Richmond, British Columbia, it's overwhelmingly Chinese, and this is not where young white families are going to go. Brampton near Toronto is overwhelmingly South Asian. All of those trends are deepening, and so the kind of if you look at the national segregation indices, it looks like nothing's happening because the minority areas are becoming more minority, and the white areas are getting some minority overflow. So it looks like actually nationally nothing's happening, but actually whites are not entering into areas that have transitioned. And so actually there is segregation occurring. I think that those things will be relevant and noticed. How much they're playing into the vote, again, that's something that needs more research.
Well, I actually have some of the preliminary data here from Abacus data on what was motivating people aged 18 to 29 when they went into the voting booths for this election. And it seems to be that it seems more to be bread and butter technical concerns than the sort of cultural concerns Connor's talking about. Reducing the cost of living comes out on top. Second is making housing more affordable, and then very controversially, making Canada a better place to live is up there as well. But I mean, and all of those could to some extent feed into these demographic and cultural questions, but that they're not immediately salient. Do you think that people like Poilievre and the Canadian nominal right in general have missed a trick in trying to connect these very important cultural and demographic factors to these sorts of bread and butter concerns that people have day to day?
Well, I think...
Or have they been trying to do that, you think, and just...
I think there's been some of that, but I think there's just been a tentativeness in Poilievre in going after immigration in a big way. I also think, when the national debate excludes it, when the national press excludes it,
makes it difficult to break
that
through.
Makes some difference, at least to older voters. But there's no doubt that these are factors of concern. I mean, I think in a survey like that, they're not asking about cultural things.
No.
Now, it is worth saying that Canada has a very weakly developed historical consciousness, so that kind of the implicit preservationist instinct is maybe not as strong as it would be in a European country. I think that's probably fair to say, and that would hold in Australia, I know which we haven't talked about as much, but where a lot of the same dynamics are going on, that there is a very weak emphasis on heritage and history as stories that people grow up with. I know that's atrophied a lot here too,
yes.
but
it collapsed more quickly there for historical reasons to do with the fact that I think you've talked about this before. I mean, there's this sense in which Canadian nationalism, to the extent that it exists at all, is that we're multicultural, which already makes you post-national rather than national. Right. We like maple syrup, and we are not America. And now it's kind of been intensified by, and still less are we, Trump's America. Right. And so Canadian nationalism today is weirdly gung-ho about not being Trump's America, about tariffs and trade policy, and that explains why when you ask Canadians over the age of 60 what was their most important concern, it was dealing with Trump, and making Canada a better place to live was like 5%, because they're sort of ultra-nationalistic about that, and yet the back door is completely open to millions coming from the subcontinent. How do we explain the demented nature of Canadian nationalism, such as it does exist? Tell us a bit about some of the intellectual history there, figures like Kim LeCoeur, figures like Charles Taylor.
Right. Well, it's interesting you bringing those figures up because, what you have are competing symbol structures of national identity. And so you have one symbol structure that's all about multiculturalism, immigration, and being politically correct, which probably appeals to a relatively small fragment. But then there's something broader, this anti-American thing, which has always been the dominant, even especially when it was a British country, that was about being anti-American. So the anti-American thing is the longest, that's the connecting thread back. going back to the loyalists, right? But, there is then the secondary question about, well, crapping on your founding father, John A. Macdonald, so that all the statues are boarded up or knocked down, essentially denying your historical roots, going at, trying to smear, the country as a land of settler colonialists, all of this kind of stuff which is emanating from the universities, the schools, the institutions.
And then the grave hoax feeds into that.
The hoax is very much all part of that. So that was this Trudeau, no core identity, no mainstream, post-national. That's kind of been the elite narrative which has been pushed hard for decades, along with multiculturalism. Now, that's always been been counterbalanced by what I call like the everyday nationalism around, maple syrup and hockey in the landscape, which is the more ordinary things that most Canadians identify with. But the historical side, I think the decline of the empire, the weakening of those connections, and there just hasn't been much of a job done in terms of crafting something like the American founding father narrative, right? So I'm saying the American one has, of course, been under assault from progressives the same way.
But it had a stronger immune response because it was of such long-standing pedigree.
Right.
And you could also argue in the Canadian case that whereas the anti-Americanism used to be the flip side of something more positive, namely a kind of pro-British loyalism,
right.
And now that that's out of the picture, it is just anti-Americanism, and then it's latched itself onto the figure of Trump.
Yeah, and I think, if we look, I'd say Australia and New Zealand, you have something similar. I mean, they were never as loyalist as Canada, but on the other hand, if you take the sort of British-Irish convict heritage of Australia, I mean, my sense is that this is not necessarily, at least the myths, at least the heroes, there isn't necessarily such a strong myth-symbol complex, ethno-history there. It's weak. It's not a very historically conscious society, as is New Zealand, and this is one of the reasons the indigenous stuff kind of occupies that space and can dominate so much along with the multiculturalism. So it's multiculturalism plus indigenous. That becomes your historical narrative, and the baddies are the settler colonialists. And that sort of matrix has taken root in all three countries, but with some resistance, like clearly we saw in that Australian voice to Parliament referendum that was rejected, but now, so there is somewhat of a battle for the national memory and the national narrative. I mean, Canada was interesting, the memorial or the Remembrance Day when they tried to do a land acknowledgement, and that went down badly, and that was the first sign that, okay, actually there is even the last remnants of a spine here in pushing back against revisionism.
Do you think that we haven't mentioned this person yet, but do you think there's hope for the People's Party for Maxime Bernier, the leader of the People's Party of Canada? Because I think the problem, of course, is that antipathy to Trump, which is very widespread in Canada. I mean, I was actually there, even in rural Canada, more conservative Canada, fairly recently, and there were anti-Trump signs. People in conversation were just generally scoffing about Trump and all that sort of. And I completely understand why he's made some eccentric moves in relation to Canada, and it makes sense that the Canadian people should feel that way. But because Maxime Bernier does identify as a kind of MAGA-adjacent populist, he's much more strong on things like immigration, on the culture war, on these sorts of things. But because he codes in people's minds as Trump-adjacent, is he going to be tainted by that apathy? And could we really have done with 5 years of just failed leadership under Poilievre? Would that have radicalized the Canadian right more than more of the same is going to do?
Yeah, I mean, one of the lost opportunities in a way is that if Poilievre had got in, then, if you look at the numbers, most conservative voters want immigration reduced. I mean, overwhelmingly. They are anti-woke, all of these things. Poilievre gets in. If he does a Boris Johnson, Liz Truss show, which I suspect is what he would have done, then you would have had people wake up and say, oh, okay, so actually they're not the real thing, and our only choice is to go with a populist. Now, Bernier, who's not very strong in English, who's not necessarily the right man,
he's
but
a Quebecois man, isn't he?
He's certainly, and also he's spreading himself thin in the sense that he's like to the right on every issue. And I guess my view is you kind of have to pick your spots. If you're assembling a coalition, to get a maximum winning coalition, you've got to moderate on some issues. I don't think you can be, maximally to the right on everything from vaccines to the economy to supply, everything. So he's a total libertarian and he's going to be a conservative. But I think the process of starting with a right-wing party that doesn't really deliver people wake up. That happened in the Netherlands. It happened here. That's the prelude to strengthening the populist right or a grassroots rebellion, which can then push the party into a more sensible place on cultural issues. Because really that's the big vacuum is on questions around the complete woke takeover of Canadian institutions and education, which is more extreme even than here. And actually, the whole immigration debate, you need some kind of a populist rebellion in order to send a signal to the mainstream parties that they can't just do establishment conservatism anymore. So that's what I was looking for. It hasn't happened. I think Canadian politics will head into a different phase now, which I think will be a very much more polarized phase than it's been. The polarization will be much more evident now.
I think that's the lesson that we're all hoping the Anglosphere learn, because other than America, we seem to have been uniquely exposed, staying within those confines of the Overton window, where both mainstream parties are the same, different bland flavors of the same neoliberal pro-migration, pro-woke consensus. You mentioned the Australians. It doesn't look like Peter Dutton's doing all that well as the alternative to the Conservatives, and he seems to be very happy-clappy about more Indian migration there too, despite a large number of Australian Zoomers complaining about the scarcity of housing. And they're sort of 5 years behind us. They're talking about the economic issues. They're just sort of catching up on the cultural issues. Do you think that Canada, hopefully, but also other Anglosphere nations will learn from Poilievre's defeat that you can't squish your way to victory anymore? Like, you can't just rebrand and microwave David Cameron's 2010 conservatism as the antidote to the total woke takeover of the institutions?
Well, I'm not sure the electoral defeat will teach that lesson, partly because in some ways his numbers aren't that bad. I mean, he's got quite a strong popular vote. The way I see the squishiness being squeezed out is more when the Conservatives do get elected, they don't deliver, and then their constituents or a populist right party squeezes them. So I think if we're talking about seeing sense on the cultural side, it's that process that's going to get us there. And then also the Conservatives moving on to that more cultural terrain and doing well or not losing, which I don't think they will. I think it'll probably not make much difference either way. It might make a bit of difference, as we saw in the U.S. case. So I think that's kind of the lesson there. But I think you're right about the squishiness in Poilievre. I also think it may be that in some electorates it's going to take some learning on the part of the electorate about what they're in for, what their politicians are really going to do to them. So it's going to be interesting to watch Australia and Canada over a few cycles. Like I sense, Australia has. They've got Pauline Hanson, and New Zealand has Winston Peters, and they get in the single digits, maybe the upper single digits, but it's not, their media landscape is like Canada's, it's progressive dominated. Australia maybe a little less so. But so far the voters have not yet, I think, fully woken up in either country. And I think they will. It's just how this manifests itself over a number of election cycles. But I think they're in some ways behind where U.S. and Europe are on this, but I think they are. I think all countries are going to be converging onto the same pathway. It's just a question of when it happens.
I have two more questions before we go to questions from our members. Thank you for sticking us with us up to this point.
It's
been very, very interesting. First one is, I suppose, quite practical. What specific advice would you give to Max Bernier on how to contend with this new environment? Because, as you said, there's a sense in which he would have had more luck if he'd been able to try and outflank a Poilievre government from the right, rather than remain relevant while there's a Liberal government ongoing. And do you think that one thing that definitely does need to happen is almost sort of the meta-narrative of Canada needs to be changed? Because one thing I found when I was there recently talking to, again, fairly rural, conservative-minded people in rural Ontario, I was asking, even they sort of signed up to this whole kind of post-national Canada thing. We kind of really are a nation of immigrants, aren't we? And there wasn't this sense that, no, we're actually a nation of Anglo-French settlers, and most Canadian people, until very, very recently, could trace their heritage back to 200 years in that kind of European direction. Then, of course, you've got the Indigenous mix there as well, and their rights to reservations should be respected and all the rest of it. But it really was it was a binational situation. It was never just this kind of multi-culti mosaic. Do you think that Bernier needs to kind of try and reshape the narrative of Canadian politics in that way, or should it be more day-to-day, picking his battles and that sort of thing, as you're saying, or both?
Yeah, I mean, I think both is the answer. I mean, you're right that there is a sort of vacuum in the center of Canadian historical consciousness. And I suspect that's there too in a place like New Zealand and to some degree Australia as well. That represents the complete victory after the end of the British Empire of the left, who has come into control of the country's cultural meaning-making institutions. And so really this is a work of a generation of essentially expunging and rewriting the history that is taught, making it more accurate. No Canadian will know that the Orange Order ran Toronto from 1870 to the 1950s. These sorts of things. Like, nobody would know any of this stuff because it's completely airbrushed out of the history books. And so, I think this takes... But what this sort of points to is we need a much more serious approach to culture. And that it isn't just all about, cutting tax and individualism, which has really been the Canadian right-wing tradition, has just been a sort of Western republicanism. It's all so it's partly about recovering a kind of cultural traditional conservatism in a place where that has been completely destroyed with the British Empire. We see in the U.S. case, for example, at least Trump, I mean, he's doing a lot of things which I think are very counterproductive, but I think the trying to get into culture, into education. Let's look at the national history standards. What is being taught? Let's look at critical race theory. Let's really try and take all of that on. I think that's really got to become a much more front and center battle for the right across the Anglosphere. And they've lost all the battles on the curriculum. The educational establishment has just outrun them. Even when Michael Gove and was it Abbott in Australia talk about the black armband view of history, and they say a few words. They might, in the U.S. they had a commission, but ultimately the education establishment took it over and ran with it and won. And that cannot. You need somebody with stamina for whom this is a big issue, who isn't just going to talk about foreign policy and the economy. And this is. I think we're starting to get there, but we need a right that is going to put culture first.
And so if Maxime Bernier is listening, more on cultural renaissance and less on the Laffer curve might be the way for him to go. As for Poilievre, because one of the things that people are saying is that Trump sort of killed Poilievre's chances because Poilievre was running on economics and energy policy. The Liberals were very clever. They got rid of the carbon tax and they made some other kind of last-minute changes that gave Carney a boost. And then, of course, Trump started mouthing off against Canada, talking about turning them into the 51st state, calling them governor rather than prime minister. Question, do you think that Trump did kill Poilievre's chances? Because one of the things I find difficult to wrap my head around about that is that Trump was attacking Poilievre quite a bit. And if people dislike Trump, why did that not endear Poilievre to the Canadian people?
Well, because I just think the Trumpian sort of power trippy attitude about the 51st state and throwing on the tariffs, like Canada's, 20% of its economy is U.S. exports, right? So there's definitely a very strong threat, and there's no question Trump gave the election to the Liberal
But
Party.
why did Poilievre not benefit from the fact that Trump was attacking him if people dislike Trump?
Well, because there's two things. I mean, one is in just a general rule of voting is when there's a national threat, even COVID, people rally around the incumbent. So the incumbent benefits, number one, as the representative symbol of the nation. So that was a huge benefit immediately to Liberals. Even under Trudeau, the gap closed by 10 points. That was the first thing. And then secondly, just any attempt to sort of say, well, Poilievre's, he was at least willing to take on the media. He was willing to call out what is this effectively completely partisan media. So he did take them on. He did say he would defund the CBC. He did do some. He was a bit more populist and pugnacious in his style.
He codes Trumpian, and if he doesn't...
Well, he's very far from Trumpian, but they can try and code him as Trumpian. And this is kind of a problem that the right is going to face. It's like, you stand for disruption and chaos.
So does Trump. We don't like Trump. You must be bad.
Right. And so tagging you as somebody who's going to destroy things and lead to insecurity and not prosperity, I mean, that is a powerful message. And I think Trump is making it much harder for, at least in the Anglosphere. We'll see the impact on Dutton, but I think it's making it harder to succeed. And I just wish that he would have focused on the border and the cultural issues much more, whereas the other stuff is foreign policy and the tariffs is all disruptive and to no obvious end, from what I can see.
Well, it's going to be very interesting watching Canada over the next 5 years and seeing if it degenerates into even more of a cautionary tale for the West than it already is. But listen, Eric, thank you for joining us up until this point. We have 2 or 3 questions from members addressed specifically to you, so stick around for that.
I will.
Connor, thank you very much. As ever, if you would like to catch the extra members section, do consider joining up as an NCF member. You can do that by joining on our website online. For now, thank you for sticking with us up until this point, and we look forward to seeing you on the next one.
Our mission at the New Culture Forum is and always has been to defend and celebrate Britain's history, culture, and its people, and indeed Western civilization, at a time when both are under sustained attack. We have grown from small beginnings to become the country's most influential right-leaning cultural think tank. Our content is watched and read by some of Britain's most influential political figures. But now, we need your help. If you believe in what we do, then please do become a member. For as little as £4 a month, you can make a vital contribution to what we do. As a member of the NCF family, you will help ensure that we can continue to produce quality content online, such as our 3 weekly programs, Whittle, which is our flagship interview show, Newspeak, our panel discussion show, and Deprogrammed, which is targeted at Britain's youth. As you probably know, in addition, we produce important documentaries, such as our critically acclaimed 6-part series, The West, a stunning celebration of the history and genius of Western civilization, and our ongoing documentary series, Heresies, with hard-hitting episodes tackling subjects such as immigration, gender ideology, and BBC bias. But the New Culture Forum is much more than a YouTube channel. We don't just complain about Britain as it is, we provide real solutions and clear policies on how we can push back against the madness and restore sanity to this nation. Our presenters are now highly sought after and have become familiar faces across the media. Our prestigious annual Smith Lecture and our regional and indeed national conferences have attracted world-class speakers. Perhaps most importantly, we are the only organisation on the right of politics that has launched a national movement without actually being a political party. And uniquely, through our NCF Locals programme, we've established some 30 active branches in towns and cities right across the nation, from Edinburgh to Exeter, and with many more on the way. We're very proud of what we've achieved, and our members have made it possible. In return, our members receive access to exclusive content, invitations to private events, free or discounted tickets to our conferences and lectures, free copies of our books, and much more. I very much hope that you'll join us too by clicking the link in the description or going to our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Now is the time that we need your help. Thank you.